Starting on April 30th, the world's top advisors are meeting at the ACE Academy for the Exceptional Advisor Conference in San Diego, California. This conference features world-class thought leaders, industry-leading practitioners, and Ivy League academics who will be speaking about the latest investment management, private wealth, retirement management, behavioral science, and practice management strategies you need to know in order to better advise your clients. It's not too late to join us, so be sure to register online for more details, and we look forward to seeing you there.
We're proud to welcome you to the Exceptional Advisor podcast series, brought to you by the Investments and Wealth Institute. This series aims to help you to better serve your clients, differentiate yourself from the competition, and enhance your ability to communicate those differences.
Bob, hey, thanks so much. So glad to be here.
It's a pleasure. Before we get going, for the benefit of our listeners who may not be familiar with you and your work, do you mind giving us a brief overview?
Oh, happy to. So my current role is head of wealth solutions for J.D. Power, and that means I'm responsible for translating the data and insights we garner from our syndicated and broad industry studies into practical performance improvement initiatives. So that's what I do now, but I've got a almost 30-plus year background in industry in the broker-dealer ecosystem, everything from being an advisor to being a wholesaler to being head of practice management. I also have a pretty deep academic background in organizational learning and organizational science, which actually informs much of the work that I do. So I've been at this probably for 20 years plus at this idea that we need to improve this state of advice. So I'm on that continued journey.
All right, we'll talk more about that. But first, let's talk about the most recent survey that J.D. Power released that looks at investor satisfaction with full-service financial advisors. And the results are somewhat unnerving.
Yeah, no, indeed. And one of the things I think we can look at first is to note that the satisfaction from clients of their advisor tracks market performance very, very closely. So yes, so the numbers were down this year over last year, but predominantly we can track that back over a couple of decades in relationship to the market. Now that's disappointing in a couple of ways. One, it says that the clients are pretty much putting all the value of their advisor on market performance, which we know is really not appropriate. But it also speaks to the fact that most advisors have that investment-centric value proposition, which leads to that. So it's troubling. It's a systemic issue that I think is embedded within our industry.
Yeah. Maybe you can just talk a bit about why you think the value proposition, why advisors place the value proposition on their investment advice.
Yeah, well, so Bob, I think that goes back also decades. If you think of the beginning of our industry, where we started, we have a legacy sales culture that's embedded within our industry. And that's been very tough to shake. And whether it's within whether it's in compensation, strategy, and the way the processes that are deployed by advisors and their firms, wholesalers coming in every day pitching their latest product, all of that has kind of buried us in this sales-centric mode. And it's been very difficult to extract from that. Now, I think we are, as we said a few moments ago, we're starting to make that turn, but it's a bit like the Titanic.
Yeah.
Well, maybe that's not the best phrase, but like the Queen Mary, right? Very big ship to turn. But it's, culture is simply the behaviors that are valued.
Yeah.
And if we think about even the language within our industry of production and how we rank the best advisors by the most AUM, not to say that's a bad thing, and it's very much a determinant or an indicator of someone doing good things, but it's not the only determinant.
Yeah. So one of the other key findings in this study talks about there being a small fraction of advisors who are currently offering comprehensive advice. Talk more about that.
Yeah. So what we did is we built out a model 3 years ago now, where we looked at arguably the state of advice. Now, it started from an experiential perspective. You and I both know and can list out the attributes that make advice, right? The attributes that make or break the advice proposition. And so we define that simply as, one, is the advice comprehensive? And that's from the client's perspective, not the industry's perspective. Yeah. And that's going to change depending on who it is. Do you understand me, my goals and needs, my aspirations? Do you understand my risk tolerance and respect that? Do you have my best interest? And by the way, that's an interesting one. This year, only 62% of clients said with certainty that their advisor had their best interest in mind. Do I understand the fees I'm paying? Is there a plan? And is the advisor an integral part of my life? And there's a few metrics we bring into there. So those are the attributes we use. And again, they're pretty fair, pretty reasonable.
Yeah.
And when we, go ahead. Yeah.
No, go ahead.
Yeah. Well, and so when we look at that and we model that out from transactional, the least, to goals-based, we call it just labeled, to the middle sort of average to comprehensive on the right, there's about 11% of advisors that fulfill on all those attributes through the eyes of the client, where the client says emphatically, yes, my advisor does that. The middle segment is about 42%, where the client says yes or I think so. There's a pretty wide chasm between those two answers.
Yeah.
And then on the left, transactional, which is 40+%, that's when the client either is neutral or negative about any one of those attributes. So that's how we built that out. But again, troubling. Only 11% are falling in this ideal. And the net promoter score, the advocacy score is dramatically different from almost 90 on the far right to the 60s in the middle to the 30s on the left.
Wow. That's troubling. You mentioned goals-based advice. There's a big move in the financial planning world, financial advice world, toward providing goals-based advice. There's much debate around it. Do you not view goals-based advice as comprehensive planning?
So it's interesting. The labels that we placed on the model were, in one sense, arbitrary, right? Goals-based seemed to work. But I always think about this. And if your advice isn't goals-based, what is it based on? So I almost think it's almost a non sequitur. Maybe that's not the right word, but it's a given that of course it's goals based. The way I view this, if we look left to right, transactional is selling. Goals based is consultative selling.
That's it.
And comprehensive is actually advice. And there are different processes between selling and advice.
Yeah.
So if it leads us in the right direction, it's the right label, and it's getting advisors to understand their clients better, put their client's best interest more forward, to utilize financial planning, then great. Let's call it goals-based advice.
Yeah.
But in our model, it's just sort of the average in the middle.
Yeah. It's part of the problem. When I think about comprehensive advice, I think that there are many advisors, given the sort of the plethora of business models and regulatory environments, that are handcuffed to provide comprehensive advice, right? Like, at some firms, you might not be able to talk about a reverse mortgage, for instance, right? Or at some firms, you might not be able to talk about a mortgage, like or long-term care insurance, right? There's sort of limitations with respect to the silo they operate within respect to the compliance that they operate with, and perhaps even the business model. Any thoughts about like the degree to which advisors are hamstrung?
Yeah. So I don't disagree. I think the culture of the firm has a very big impact on whether they can provide or do provide comprehensive advice. Now, I think the product limitation is a little bit of an out, because it's not, let's face it, Bob, I mean, how much product is on the shelf? And if somebody can't provide a reverse mortgage, it doesn't mean they can't say to the client, if they have knowledge and expertise around it, to send them to someone who could do a reverse mortgage.
Right.
So I think the limitations in providing comprehensive advice are, I'm going to suggest threefold. Going back to the cultural component, that it is so difficult that the firms and advisors are working in an environment that is so sales-centric, and there's a lot of definition, ways we could define that. It's kind of like a fish swimming in water. You don't even know you're in it. And then, when we think about the process, that's the second part, is that there's a difference between a sales process and an advice process. So no matter how good you try to get at being client-focused when you sell, you're still trying to sell. And there's a different goal, there's a different outcome, and there's fundamentally a different process. And then I think the last piece is having that, I use the phrase, and I write for Barron's, and I have a number of articles speaking to this, and I use the phrase, irrefutable moment of truth.
Right.
Having that irrefutable moment of truth. Bob, you come to me and I say, hey, here's the continuum, here's where things are dispersed, where do you think you are? And as an advisor, you're probably going to go, well, I'm a little more right than they actually are.
Yeah.
Because they don't know.
Yeah.
Very few advisors understand exactly how their clients perceive the advice experience. They understand If they're satisfied, they may understand if they're advocating, but they don't necessarily understand why or why not.
Yeah. The other key finding is that just more than half of full-service wealth clients have financial plans. Man, let's talk about that.
Well, so in many ways, that's good, meaning that more people have plans. Now, it's interesting, that number is flat over the last 3 years. And we know the emphasis on financial planning. We know the power of financial planning as a conduit and a mechanism to enable deeper discussions, longer-term view, better understanding, best interest, better line. I mean, financial planning makes all the sense in the world. It is the fundamental, it's the foundation of good advice. So let's say one, it's okay. It's almost 6 out of 10 for the industry. But the real challenge is, what we found this year is those that do have financial plans, which should be this mechanism to drive more comprehensive advice, that almost half of clients with financial plans don't perceive they're getting comprehensive advice. A third don't think that their advisors have their best interest in mind or understand them. Now, I don't know how that happens when you're sitting down and working through, a financial planning process, but there's something broken there, and we need to fix that, and I suggest fix it pretty quickly.
Yeah. When you think about people not thinking that their advisor is working in their best interest, and regardless of what definition you use, the SEC or ERISA or some other organization, people understand if someone's working in their best interest or not, right? At their core.
Mm-hmm. No, and agreed. And we actually get occasionally pushback from different folks about, well, it's a legal definition. And no, if I say to you, Bob, do I have your best interest in mind? You're going to know it innately or not. By the way, the same thing with the definition of comprehensive.
Yeah.
Some people will say, well, clients don't know what comprehensive is. Yeah, they do for them. And by the way, if they don't, part of the process is to help them understand what advice can be. And I'm going to use an analogy near and dear to both our hearts, okay? So I enjoy eating. And if you go to someone and, they happen to really like an Italian chain restaurant, best Italian food, and good for them, right? No, nothing against Italian chain restaurants. But then you take them to Hanover Street, you take them to the North End, and all of a sudden they go, oh, that's what it's supposed to be like. And that's one of these tipping points that's going to occur in our industry. Client expectations are continuing to rise. And when they see what can be, because right now there's not a lot of attrition from that middle and left silo, sort of that average and less than average experience. But once they understand, I think we're going to see more attrition. And Bob, one more part of that, we're seeing folks, they're not attriting, right? They're not leaving. So that there's a sense that they're satisfied. And this goes the sort of the equation of satisfaction is a function of expectations.
Yeah.
Just because a client says they're satisfied doesn't mean that they're getting the ideal. And I think a lot of advisors are lulled into that with their year-end surveys. Hey, my clients love me. I have 96% retention. Yeah. Is that really because you're delivering something great, or is it because they don't know any better?
Yeah. Years ago, I worked for a tiny research company, and we had done investor satisfaction surveys. And one of the things that always seemed to come up as the reason for someone leaving an advisor was, in part, they didn't return my phone calls or they didn't communicate with me. Right? They could withstand market volatility and down markets, but if the advisor wasn't reaching out to them, maybe explaining what was going on, or contacting them on some regular basis, they would leave. I don't know if you found that to be true in your surveys or not, but
so absolutely. And so in a couple of ways, we do research. Our study goes fairly wide and deep. The advisory experience is a component of that. Now, granted, the advisory experience has an outsized influence on what happens in satisfaction, but we see that in the service area, the difference between having really good service and just good service can have a big impact on advocacy and hence and even attrition. But yeah, I think this, if we think about really good advice, so the phrase I like to use, and this is my advisor, I have a wonderful advisor. He falls really hard right on the continuum, really comprehensive. But one of the attributes is integral part of life. I use the phrase first call after family. Big decision, something going on, you're talking about it, I got to call Paul.
Yeah.
He's in. And I was just talking to him yesterday, actually, and he's he actually had a great statement. I hadn't heard this before, and I think it's worth sharing. So often in our business, we talk about how it's important to care and show empathy, and we lead with that.
Yeah.
He said it's the exact opposite. He said the last thing he brings to the table, the ribbon on the package, the icing on the cake is caring. He brings tremendous competency, and then adds the deep care and understanding on top of that, and that's what makes the experience so amazing, as opposed to someone who cares about you but doesn't have the competence. Right? And I hadn't heard that before, and I was like, I'm stealing that.
Yeah.
So here I am telling it.
I have to say, it's a trigger word, competency, right? The advice profession is always trying to demonstrate competency, and I've always asked, how do you demonstrate competency?
Well, so no, that's a good question. So I mentioned early on my academic background is organizational learning, organizational science. So, I mean, there's certainly constructs that academic constructs that make competencies, defined as knowledge, skills, and attitudes and mindsets. But really, competency is displayed in performance. And I don't mean market performance. I mean performance of that skill. So I think, one, as an industry, we don't necessarily do a great job of ensuring that whatever training we do results in the performance that we want. And again, I'm not talking investment performance. I'm just talking advice performance, number one. And the other part about it too, so I think about, as a certified private wealth advisor, and I'm gonna plug IWI. The ACE conference is the best learning conference in the industry. I mean, you go to a session on retirement income, 9 out of 10 times it's going to be an annuity wholesaler.
Yeah.
At ACE, there's 3 PhDs on the stage.
Right, yeah.
Right, so just phenomenal stuff.
Yeah, this year we have Wade Pfau and David Blanchett, among others, talking about retirement.
Yeah. No, it's great. And I saw Siegel's on the...
and Siegel's there too.
Siegel, he's forgotten more than most people know about the topic. So anyway, so I think it's that driving towards the performance, and there's two things. We strive, I think, and do a lot of work around the technical competencies, the work that IWI does, and even getting a CPA. A CFA.
The CFA, yeah.
Right, CFP. Sorry, let me get that right. A CFP. But it's the advisory component. We have a lot of students coming out. I mentioned Preston Cherry in my as we were warming up, and he runs the financial planning department, University of Wisconsin, Green Bay.
Yep.
And they are getting a lot of great technical, but not necessarily the competency or the ability to perform from a relational standpoint.
Yeah.
And I don't mean buddying up, becoming friends, caring. I mean the advice process.
Yeah.
So anyway, but I know there's a long answer, Bob.
No,
but there's a lot to
I'm
unpack
glad
there.
Did a deep dive on it. Let me just stay on the comprehensive one for a second too, which is there's been a trend in the industry. Michael Kitces and others have debated whether people really need comprehensive versus modular planning. Any thoughts about, like, I just came to you for college planning. That's all I need at the moment, right?
Sure. Well, I think that's accurate, because if we think about comprehensive advice encompassing all of the financial planning and all of one's financial goals and aspirations, there's a lot of subsets of that.
Yeah.
And you don't attack all of them at once. And some have higher priorities than others. You walk in, do you have a budget? Yeah, we want to make sure that you're maximizing your tax efficiency, your portfolio. But if you don't have a budget, that's the first thing we need to do.
Yeah.
So I think innately, just in execution, it is modular.
Yeah.
If you're doing it correctly, because there's just so many different components. And as life changes, so my nephew is just turned 40. He's a millennial, but he's a 40-year-old with kids 9, 5, and 3, a thriving business, multiple real estate holdings. He's as complex as anybody in terms of his life and his planning needs. So I agree with what he's saying, but maybe not in the context of it's only modular. It's just innately modular.
Yeah. Because I think about it this way, like, you can't pull a piece of yarn off a sweater and not have it come undone, right? It's sort of like, if I'm coming to you for education planning, well, I have to think about your income tax planning, because maybe there are some credits available to you that would be worth thinking about. And and obviously maybe you have young kids, so there's an estate plan that I need to think about, right? And there's insurance planning that may need to be, so it's not just education planning, right? I mean, certainly I could help you set up a 529, but my goodness, that's just the start of it, right?
Indeed. Well, and what you're referring to is simply it is a part of a whole that can't be deconstructed.
Yeah.
So, and this is the problem with, we think about, the almost half the industry that's transactional, that's just selling things. They're going out and selling insurance policies, mutual funds, and rollovers and all that. And it's disconnected from the broader reality and the bigger picture.
Yeah. So in a way, these firms are doing what behavioral finance experts would suggest as you're incenting the behavior that you want, right? In a way.
Indeed. Yeah. No, absolutely. And that's a whole nother, of course, you bring up behavioral finance. And I had the pleasure actually of working for 8 years with Dr. Daniel Crosby.
Wow.
And now getting to spend some time with Dr. Preston Sherry.
Yeah.
And of course, Brian Portnoy's. I still love, I think
Brian's
the best line in our business is, the best way to define what we do is wealth is simply there to fund a life of meaning and contentment.
Yeah.
Now pull on that string with a client,
Yeah.
and you will be in a conversation for 30 years.
Yeah.
And that's our business.
Well, economists would be saying much the same thing, except they would say we're trying to maximize utility, right?
Yeah, right. Like that really happens every day.
So one other key finding I want you to talk about, it's younger clients ready to vote with their feet. And I'm curious about this because young people have a very different experience than I think what boomers did and the silent generation did with respect to advice.
Yeah, so part of the finding there, and when we say young, we're saying millennial and Gen Z. What's interesting, so millennials now, the oldest millennials are early 40s. Gen Zers are approaching late 20s, early 30s. A side note here, like any pendulum, things tend to swing back. I think we're going to see millennials as the most digital intensive generation. I think Gen Z, I'm seeing things anecdotally that they're going to start coming back. I actually talked to a Gen Z that likes to talk on the phone. I mean, which is amazing.
Yes.
And there's some other things as well. But what's happening with the younger generations is they have, almost half of them have a secondary relationship. So think about it. If you're working with somebody, but there's another advisor over there, the likelihood that they move, certainly heightens. And their willingness to switch is another thing we measure, is markedly higher than that of baby boomers and the next gen. I'm going to say Gen X, if I'm getting that right. Following.
Yeah.
So it's a combination of having the propensity to switch and having somebody to switch to.
Right.
That'll drive that. Now, Bob, one of the things that's interesting. So younger generations have a greater propensity to have financial plans. 75% of Gen Z have financial plans. I'm thinking it's because they work with younger advisors that most likely grew up, came into the business as planners, because that is the profession. But more of them don't think they're getting comprehensive advice than the older generations, and more of them don't think their advisor has their best interest in mind than the older generation. So this disconnect between planning and what planning really should do.
Yeah, it's also interesting. Anecdotal. My children, they've taken the initiative to learn about money in ways that I never did at their age. So they know, for instance, that they can't improve their credit score without, for instance, improving how long they've owned a credit. Right?
Mm-hmm.
So, they'll tell me I'm as high as I can get at the moment until I have a longer credit history. Or in my daughter's case, she's starting to read Morgan Housel's book, right? And it's a good start, right? So I think they're taking initiative in ways that I perhaps never did as a young 20-something.
Yeah. Well, agreed. And listen, every generation, has their macro worldview, the shared worldview that makes. I mean, like you and I could sit down and talk about movies we watched throughout our lives, and we're a Gen Z or someone in their 20s would go, I don't even know what you're talking about, let alone music, right? And so I think we are seeing the younger generations growing up in more difficult financial environments. And maybe the seriousness of life and the things around them may be a little more pronounced than we grew up. I don't know. We're probably not too far off in age. So it's interesting. But with that said, now I'm going to go back to something. All that said, if we go back to the advisory experience continuum with this comprehensive being the ideal, and by the way, not only do we see advocacy scores higher for comprehensive advice, again, or somewhere around 90, But there's also 4 other metrics I like to use they're metrics that attribute value to the relationship. And they include overall experience, loyalty, value for fees paid, and level of trust. And also when we go Net Promoter Score, overall experience rating, value for fees paid, level of trust, and loyalty, when we use all 5 of those to say how valuable is the experience to the client, we see that same dispersion of scores from very high for comprehensive to middling for the goals-based to very low for transactional.
Yeah.
So the same thing holds true for our younger generations. They want a good experience.
Yeah.
The dispersion for younger generations is the same.
Yeah.
So we may think, well, we got to get digital, we got to get hip to work with younger generations, right? And often what firm practices will do, the more advanced practices, they'll working with the clients, when the kids come in, they'll grab the junior advisor and say, go work with them. What that creates is cultural affinity. That doesn't necessarily create confidence, though.
Yes.
And if they don't get that comprehensive experience and all the things out of it, i.e. best interest and you understand me and all those things that I mentioned before, they're more likely to attrit. They're more likely to notice that.
Yeah.
Right. So this fundamental value proposition that we're striving for, that such a small subset of our industry is delivering now, is the answer.
Yeah. What you just said sort of sparked a question in my mind. Advisors like to do client surveys. Would you suggest that they use those attributes as what they measure, overall experience, et cetera, et cetera?
Yeah. So, research is a fairly complex process. So at JD Power, we do, I'm coining the term institutional research in the context of like institutional money management, when they're more complex, more thoughtful, and all of that. So it's not just the questions that you ask. And yes, I think those folks asking satisfaction questions, ask questions at the end of the year, they're useful, but they're not necessarily strategically useful, because someone may say, yes, I'm satisfied, but you don't know why. They may say, no, I'm not going to advocate, but you don't know why. There's issues with timing. When do the surveys actually go out? Is it really a long time after you've met? Then that what you remember becomes an issue. It's important to ask the right questions and to ask them in the right way.
Yeah. I know we've covered a lot of ground, but you talked a little bit about the profession needing to change. What needs to happen? What does it look like? What's the ideal end state?
So I'm gonna go to the comments coming out of the CFP folks about financial advice being the 4th great profession, and I believe that advice done correctly, financial advice delivered well, can have a profound impact on a client's life, a profound impact, and not just the client, but their family, their community, their generational, a really reverberating ripple effect. And the good news is there are some advisors doing that. Our industry in the right place is the majority of advisors doing that.
Yeah.
And I'm just going to say more than 50%. Right? I think there's always going to be a marketplace, if you want to go buy something, you want to buy an insurance policy, that's great. And I think that's where that transactional slot, they're not going to go away. It's just going to get renamed, right? Recategorized. Go buy something great, but that's their role.
Yeah.
Stop calling yourself an advisor because you're not. Now, I think the path there is going to require a hard look in the mirror, that irrefutable moment of truth, and a recognition that what we've done to date, think about it, the idea of client-centric comprehensive advice has been around a while.
Yeah.
We've been talking about this for a decade.
Yeah.
Yet we still haven't moved very far. And in the last decade, think of all of the resources, money, time, and effort we've put towards advisor development. Yet it isn't moving us where we need to get.
Enough.
And God bless all the folks in our industry working hard at it. But when you've been doing something for a long time and you're not getting the results you want, it kind of says it's not working.
Yeah.
So we need to rethink how we're developing advisors. And to me, that's moving towards the advice process versus the sales process. and so forth.
So I often think that if you had to build this profession from scratch, it wouldn't look anything like it looks today. It would be like the fourth great profession. But there are hurdles to overcome, right? There are regulatory hurdles. There are compensation business model hurdles. I mean, do you propose like ripping up the rug or is this a gradual thing, or can we work within those confines?
Yeah. So, I mean, really good question. And it's sort of, there's an ideal and then there's a reality. So are we going to be able to just disintegrate the industry and start from scratch? No. We've got the old phrase, play the ball where it lies.
Yeah.
So, but we have a segment, and I want to suggest it's the RIA space, where we see that segment executing, and I don't know this from research. I'm doing this. I'm just from we would probably imagine as we engage and work with different folks in the RIA space that they're probably delivering on a more ideal value prop.
Yeah.
But it is. I think it comes down to two things. One, either the clients are going to change the industry because they're going to recognize the North End, right? And that's really a play, I guess, on the North Star, right? They're going to recognize there is a better North Star, that there is a better experience, and they're going to flee. They're going to vote with their feet, and they're going to go to those better advisors.
Yeah.
And by the way, we see that in really bad market times, right? The really good advisors gain clients. Their clients are satisfied in bad market times, where it's the opposite, the other way around. And then the other one is we're going to get that critical mass of advisors that are going to start changing. We are seeing, I've had conversations the last, let's say, 6 months, and I'll throw out some names, like Amy Weber at Cambridge. She gets this.
Yeah.
She said 85% of her clients are not getting what they want, and we need to do something about it.
Yeah. And
you look at
No, I was going to say, and to me, they're at the top of the pack in terms of, right.
Right. Yeah, no, indeed. And, folks like Doug Ketterer at Atria, Jody Perry at Raymond James, Alex David at Stifel. I mean, we've got some folks, and by the way, all those are board members of Financial Services Institute. And I think that's an organization that has their head on very straight, understands what we need to do. So it's going to be a combination of a bunch of things, but then it's ultimately, we're an advisor-driven industry, right? In terms of once we get that critical mass, so you're in an office in a large firm, and you get enough of people doing it the right way, it starts to tilt. Once it starts to tilt and lean, boom.
Well, that's encouraging. You mentioned RIAs. I'm often fond of noting the fact that duly registered advisors, right, those who have the IAR and a 7, have the full suite of products at their fingertips to use, and depending on what the client needs, doesn't have to refer out or can be the one-stop shop in many cases. Any thoughts about the benefits of being duly registered?
Yeah. So here's the great thing. If you have your client's best interest in mind and you deploy, and so this comes from organizational science, and I'll send you a book later. But if you deploy what I call process consulting, which is actually not the goal of selling, is to motivate people to act on your recommendation. Well, the goal of advice is to help people make good decisions. So if you're helping people make good decisions, which means it's incredibly transparent, incredibly knowledgeable decisions, doesn't matter whether you have a commission-based product, fee-based, or whatever, because the client is looking at it going, I understand what this is, what it does, how it fits into my picture, what I'm paying for it. It's not a commission versus fee-based issue that's driving the best interest, conundrum. Now, it definitely it doesn't help for those that do lean in the wrong direction. The book, Virtue in an Inherently, he spoke at ACE last year. Is it J.C. DeWitt or J.C. DeSwan?
I can't remember.
The guy from Yale.
Yeah.
His book is back here on my shelf. In my latest Barron article, I write about, I use his, leverage his work because our industry is inherently structurally biased to the advisor. And if we leave best interest in the hands of advisors, all those behavioral things, all the cultural things, all the compensation things, just lean people, regardless of their intent, lean people in the wrong direction.
Yeah. Adam Smith was right then. Right.
Yes, right. And I know that was a long answer to your question, but so much of what we need to do in our industry goes beyond, we need to get rid of commission products. We need more Reg BI. This is a structural issue.
That is.
And so we need to change the fundamental way that we work. And the good news is we have a very distinct process. There are people doing it. We've been able to define it and measure it, which means we can replicate it. And now, it's simple to understand. It may not be easy, but it's there and to be done.
Yeah. So we've covered a lot of ground, Tom. Anything we missed or anything that just bears reemphasizing?
Wow. Gosh, Bob. And again, this is, I was
know we can talk for hours because I so enjoyed it. Yeah.
Well, no, I appreciate it. Ditto. Indeed. I was on with a reporter yesterday, and every question he asked, I said, well, that's a really deep question. There's a lot we can go into. I think if we go back to thinking about what this study showed, what J.D. Power's full service investor study showed this year, is that, it's an issue that there's such a correlation between market performance and client satisfaction. That's not a good thing, and that should be a real eye-opening, factor for many, many firms. Now, the good news is we have time, because people are not, the word attrition, right? They're not moving in mass yet, but they will at some point. And whether it's Reg BI, which has play, but ultimately I think it's really the client movement that really drives the industry change if the industry doesn't change itself. So,
I see evidence of it happening, Tom. There's a good financial planner I know who, when people go to him for, to interview him, to use him, they come away saying, well, he told me that he's just going to deliver market returns. They use index funds, and that his value proposition isn't about managing the money. It's about managing the plan to accomplish their goals.
And let me ask you, and what is their, I'm assuming they're smiling and going, this is great. I really want to work with him.
Not often, but sometimes, yes. I mean, and when I refer people to this advisor, I warn them that they shouldn't be looking at this person to outperform the market.
Yeah. And by the way, Bob, that's good. So my head is so bent around how investment performance is important, but it's just a small subset. People are walking in looking for that person to beat the market.
Yeah.
And that's the last thing they should be looking for, because it's going to end up, it's not going to be a good ending. It's in the medium to long term. Yeah.
It's a bad ending.
Indeed.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I want to end on a good ending. So I want to thank you, and hopefully you come back next year when the next survey comes out, and we'll have moved the needle a little bit.
Well, 3 years in a row, it's stayed pretty much static, but let's hope that's the case. But Bob, thank you so much. I enjoyed that conversation and the really great work that IWI does.
Thank you for listening to the Exceptional Advisor podcast, brought to you by the Investments and Wealth Institute. If you've enjoyed this podcast, please subscribe through iTunes, Spotify, or our website at www.investmentsandwealth.org/podcast to get the latest episodes of our Exceptional Advisor podcast series. For additional resources, updates on events, and exclusive membership deals, visit www.investmentsandwealth.org.
Starting on April 30th, the world's top advisors are meeting at the ACE Academy for the Exceptional Advisor Conference in San Diego, California. This conference features world-class thought leaders, industry-leading practitioners, and Ivy League academics who will be speaking about the latest investment management, private wealth, retirement management, behavioral science, and practice management strategies you need to know in order to better advise your clients. It's not too late to join us, so be sure to register online for more details, and we look forward to seeing you there.